Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Last week on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
But Jimmy, you only told us what the official response to Medjugorje has been. You haven't discussed your own view of the apparitions. What do you make of them and whether they're supernatural?
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about next week.
You're listening to episode 339 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Jimmy's evaluation of Medjugorje. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In 1981, 6 young people in Medjugorje began reporting apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And in 2024, the Holy See announced that nothing obstructs the faithful from having a devotion to Medjugorje, provided they keep certain clarifications in mind. But the Holy See didn't comment one way or the other on whether Medjugorje is of supernatural or natural origin. And that's something people want to know. So what about it? Is Medjugorje supernatural or natural? And what does Jimmy think about it? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, where should we begin in covering what your own investigation has found?
By giving a reminder of something I've said the last 2 weeks. Medjugorje is controversial, and one of the things I want to emphasize is that I really approach this mystery from a position of neutrality. Before researching this episode, I had not studied Medjugorje in detail, and I didn't have strong opinions about it. I was largely neutral and open to whatever the church might determine. As always, when I did start researching Medjugorje, I tried to be balanced. That means I looked at books by people who support Medjugorje, like Wayne Weibel and Mark Miravalli, and I also read works critical of Medjugorje. I've tried to determine as precisely as possible what the verifiable facts of the case are. So if you don't hear one of your favorite claims made, whether it's in favor of or opposed to Medjugorje, it may be because I couldn't verify it. As you might expect, partisans of both sides tend to play up the things that favor their case and play down the things that don't. As a result, if you hear something that sounds negative that you weren't expecting, it may be because you've been reading pro-Medjugorje works that ignore or downplay that fact. And if you hear something that sounds positive that you weren't expecting, it may be because you've been reading anti-Medjugorje works that ignore or downplay that fact. As always, I'm trying to be strictly neutral and fact-based in what I present here. I also don't mind if you disagree with my conclusions. I will be telling you what conclusions I've come to because I do that on this show as a matter of self-discipline. That's why we always have the bottom line segment at the end. But I'll reveal right now that my opinions are tentative, and the church has made it clear that private apparitions are not obligatory for our faith anyway. So if you disagree with me, go right ahead. That's totally fine. I'd only ask that you think as charitably of me as I try to think of those who have other positions.
So how do you want to proceed in today's episode?
I want to start by surveying the arguments that have been put forward by others, both for and against Medjugorje being supernatural. That will give us a sense of what's been said before. Specifically, before the Ruini Commission, which divided Medjugorje into 2 phases, phase 1, which was the first 10 days, and phase 2, which was everything that's come since. And we'll then see if that distinction makes a difference in how we evaluate the apparition. So we'll look at Medjugorje as a whole first, both pro and con, and then we'll look at it divided into the 2 phases. And by the way, I'm going to be cross-examining both the arguments favoring and opposing Medjugorje as being supernatural. I believe in rigorously testing arguments, so I'm not going to cut the pro argument slack, and I'm not going to cut the con argument slack. They will both be seriously cross-examined as we consider them.
Who do you want to turn to for the pro arguments for Medjugorje, for the arguments in favor of it as a whole?
One of the books I found while researching these episodes is called Are the Medjugorje Apparitions Authentic? It was published in 2008, and it's by two well-respected supporters of the apparitions. Mark Miravalli, who is a professor of Mariology at the University of Steubenville, and Wayne Weibel, who is a journalist and was a journalist and one of the most popular writers on Medjugorje. Together, they argue that the apparitions are genuinely supernatural. Mark Miravalli writes the first part of the book, which is devoted to theological arguments, and Wayne Weibel writes the second part of the book, which is devoted to Medjugorje having good fruits in experience. And by the way, I'll just mention right now, that is not under dispute. Clearly, there are a lot of good fruits reported with Medjugorje, and if you have had a good fruits experience, a religious, a conversion, a miracle, or something like that, that is not under dispute. That is not being challenged. At the beginning of part one of the book, Miravalli lays out what he says are the criteria that the church uses when investigating an apparition, and he puts these into three general categories. The first category is the question of, is the message of the apparition orthodox or in conformity with church teaching? The second category is, are the phenomena connected with the apparition supernatural? He explains that one this way.
For example, does the reported visionary experience a state of ecstasy during the alleged apparition, where the individual in some sense experiences a suspension of their external senses in light of the presence of the supernatural being? The category of phenomena would include all events proximate to the reported apparition, which are inexplicable only through supernatural intervention.
And the third category is the question, is there good spiritual fruit in connection with the apparition?
How well does Miravalli's explanation correspond to the actual criteria that the church uses in its norms?
Well, not as well as I would expect. Now, this book was published in 2008, and the 1978 norms that were in effect at the time weren't publicly available until 2011, when the CDF published them on its website. Of course, they had leaked long before that. In fact, I had them on my own website, jimmyakin.com. And I'm sure that as a Mariologist, Miravalli had already had the criteria and was familiar with them. But because they hadn't been made officially available to the public, I can understand why Miravalli didn't simply quote them and tried to summarize them instead. But I don't find his summary particularly impressive. Here are the actual positive criteria, the ones that would support an apparition being authentic from the 1978 norms.
A. Moral certitude, or at least great probability of the existence of the event, acquired by means of a serious investigation. B. Particular circumstances relative to the existence and to the nature of the event, that is to say, 1. Personal qualities of the subject or of the subjects, in particular psychological equilibrium, honesty, and rectitude of moral life, sincerity and habitual docility toward ecclesiastical authority, the capacity to return to a normal regimen of a life of faith, etc. 2. As regards revelation, true theological and spiritual doctrine and immune from error. 3. Healthy devotion and abundant and constant spiritual fruit, for example, spirit of prayer, conversion, testimonies of charity, etc.
By the way, we discussed these norms back in episode 84, so you can go and listen to that for more information. You also may want to listen to episodes 321 and 322, where we talk about the new updated 2024 criteria. For present purposes, 2 of the 3 categories Miravalli summarizes correspond to what's in the 1978 norms. The positive criteria do mention doctrine that is orthodox, and they do mention spiritual fruit. Those are his first and third categories. But Miravalli's second category, about looking at how the revelation happens and whether people are in trances and things like that, is not mentioned in the criteria at all. Now, I'm not saying that investigators don't look at things like that. And if they find that someone is in a deep trance when they receive revelations, they take that into account. But my point is that is not mentioned at all in the 1978 criteria, and it's certainly not one of three major categories mentioned in them. So Miravalli is not accurately summarizing how the church looks at apparitions. He may be summarizing how some Mariologists look at them, but not the church. Also, I'd mentioned that just because someone is in a trance, that doesn't prove that it's inexplicable only through supernatural intervention, in Miravalli's words. People have all kinds of natural trances. I mean, that's what hypnosis is, for example. Miravalli also completely omits the 1978 document's most extensive criterion, which has to do with the personal qualities of the subjects reporting the revelation. And he completely omits all of the negative criteria that the church uses. For reference, here are the negative criteria that counted as evidence against an apparition being authentic in 1978.
A. Manifest error concerning the event. B. Doctrinal errors attributed to God Himself or to the Blessed Virgin Mary, or to some saint in their manifestations, taking into account, however, the possibility that the subject might have added, even unconsciously, purely human elements, or some error of the natural order to an authentic supernatural revelation. C. Evidence of a search for profit or gain strictly connected to the event. D. Gravely immoral acts committed by the subject or his or her followers when the event occurred or in connection with it. E. Psychological disorder or psychopathic tendencies in the subject that with certainty influenced on the presumed supernatural fact or psychosis, collective hysteria, or other things of this kind.
Miravalli completely omitted any discussion of these. So Miravalli mischaracterized the positive criteria and omitted the negative criteria, and I don't think his summary is a very good one. And frankly, it looks to me like he was crafting an independent set of criteria that looked designed to support the conclusion he favors. In most of part one of the book, Miravalli is actually dealing with objections to Medjugorje, which is a sign that he's actually not making a positive case and that he really should have dealt with the negative criteria, at least by way of summary, since this material doesn't deal with a positive case for Medjugorje. We'll deal with some of the things it says later. Fortunately, at the end of part one, Miravalli summarizes a positive case for the apparition, and he says,
The Medjugorje apparitions possess all the principal characteristics that the Church looks for in manifesting supernatural authenticity. The message contents are in complete conformity with the official doctrinal teachings of the Catholic Church. The phenomena that accompany the messages constitute scientifically validated ecstasy during the apparitions and numerous reports of healing. The visionaries manifest lives of moral integrity and psychological stability. The spiritual fruits from the apparitions have also had monumental worldwide effect of conversions, returns to the Church, and to proper states in life, as well as an extraordinary number of vocations to the priesthood and religious life. Further credibility is added by the fact that more than 200 bishops, archbishops, and cardinals have visited the site officially, in addition to the many unofficial visits by the shepherds of the Church. In addition, well over 100 bishops, archbishops, and cardinals have publicly expressed their belief in Our Lady's presence at Medjugorje. The spiritual fruits of conversion and spiritual peace have been the ubiquitous testimony of the greater part of the 40 million pilgrims who have come to Medjugorje, and have responded to the Queen of Peace's call for greater faith, prayer, fasting, conversion, and peace.
So that's the summary of his positive case. It consists of 7 points. 1, the messages of Medjugorje are orthodox. He says, in complete conformity with church teaching. 2, the seers are in verified ecstasies when they receive the revelations. 3, there are numerous reports of healings. 4, the visionaries are moral and psychologically stable. 5, there are abundant spiritual fruits. 6, more than 200 bishops have officially visited the site, and 7, more than 100 bishops have expressed their belief in Medjugorje.
What do you make of this case?
Well, let's look at some of the individual claims he makes. Claim number 6, that more than 200 bishops have officially visited the site, whatever an official visit is not relevant. There are more than 5,000 Catholic bishops in the world, so if 200 made official visits, that's 4% of the total. Even if you go up to 300 bishops, since he says it's more than 200, that would only be 6% of the total, meaning 94% of the bishops have not visited the site. Further, visiting a site or officially visiting it does not mean that you think the apparitions are supernatural. And most fundamentally, how many bishops have officially visited a site is simply not one of the criteria that the church uses when evaluating an apparition. So this claim is not relevant as evidence for supernaturality.
What about the related claim, number 7, that over 100 bishops have expressed belief in Medjugorje? In their case, they did express belief in the apparition.
Well, frankly, it's also not relevant. 100 bishops would be 2% of the total of Catholic bishops, and even if you go up to 200 bishops, it would only be 4%, meaning that 96% of Catholic bishops have not expressed belief in Medjugorje. And most fundamentally, how many bishops have expressed belief in an apparition is simply not one of the criteria the church uses. So this claim also is not relevant. What both of these claims have in common is, frankly, that they're cherry-picking the data by looking at some bishops but not others. And they also both have in common the fact that they are not criteria the church uses, so they are both not relevant.
What about claim number 5, that there is abundant spiritual fruit connected with Medjugorje?
That's very true, there is. In fact, there's even been a sociological study on this by Luca Presenti of the Catholic University of Milan. In the press conference announcing the Vatican decision, Andrea Tornielli of the Dicastery for Communications cited these figures. He said,
"The great majority of those who return to Medjugorje indicate a change of life. 48.8% declare that something changed after the first visit, and that much changed for a further 30.4%. Up to a radical change declared in 14.5% of cases. The Medjugorje effect leads to an increase in frequency of religious practice, the sacraments, and prayer."
So there are measurable good fruits connected with Medjugorje, but there are 2 points that need to be made. First, some kind of good fruits are guaranteed to be the case in a situation like this. Miravalli noted that by 2008, when the book came out, there had already been 40 million pilgrims to Medjugorje, and estimates in the current year, 2024, are that there have been more than 50 million pilgrims. So with that number of people involved, you are bound to have a lot of conversions and vocations and so forth. If you have that number of pilgrims go into a site, many of them with expectations of having a spiritual experience, then you're going to get reports of spiritual experiences. I hate to put it this way because I know a lot of ardent Medjugorje supporters may not like it, but I believe in being as thoroughly objective as possible, and as a verification check, it's always helpful to think about parallel situations that don't involve something you personally support. So let's think about a parallel situation where millions of non-Christians go on a pilgrimage. The one that springs to mind is the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims are expected to perform if they can. This is known as the Hajj, and it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Every year, 2 to 3 million pilgrims travel to Mecca to participate in religious rituals there, and that's about the same number as come to Medjugorje each year, at least recently. Many go with expectations of having a spiritual experience, and after they get back, they get to include Al-Haji as part of their names, so they have a changed social role. They've proved that they're real devout Muslims. They're at what is for them the holiest place on earth. I mean, they're literally walking in the footsteps of Muhammad. And for many, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so expectations can be high. It's thus no surprise with that many millions of Muslims with expectations showing up in one place that many of them will report spiritual experiences. And we have sociological evidence that the experience has a transformative effect on them. We'll have a link to a paper that studies that, but to quote from the abstract of the paper,
we find that participation in the Hajj increases observation of global Islamic practices, such as prayer and fasting, while decreasing participation in localized practices and beliefs, such as the use of amulets and dowry. It increases belief in equality and harmony among ethnic groups and Islamic sects, and leads to more favorable attitudes toward women, including greater acceptance of female education and employment. Increased unity within the Islamic world is not accompanied by antipathy toward non-Muslims. Instead, Hajis show increased belief in peace and equality and harmony among adherents of different religions. The evidence suggests that these changes are more a result of exposure to and interaction with Hajis from around the world, rather than religious instruction or a changed social role of pilgrims upon return.
So with that many people of any religion undertaking a spiritual exercise like going on a pilgrimage to what they consider to be a holy place, you're going to get numerous reports of spiritual experiences, and these will have measurable sociological effects whether or not there is an apparition that's supernatural at the site.
Okay, that's the first point you said was relevant here. What's the second?
The church does not regard spiritual fruit as sure evidence of the supernaturality of an apparition. We talked about this last week, the need to distinguish between an apparition itself and the spiritual fruit that occurs in conjunction with it, which was one of the things that then Cardinal Ratzinger discussed back in 1985, and it's subsequently been incorporated into the 2024 norms. In short, the Holy Spirit can be working in the lives of people when they undertake a religious exercise in connection with an apparition, even if the apparition itself was not supernatural. It's not the apparition that produces the spiritual fruit. It's the fact that people are reaching out to God and seeking to grow closer to Him. God rewards people when they do that, even if they have only a partial or incomplete understanding of Him. In fact, that may be part of what produces the spiritual experiences that Muslims report when they reach out to God as part of the Hajj. And it may be part of what produces the spiritual experiences reported by Muslims who visit Medjugorje, because in addition to Catholics, there are also Orthodox Christians and Muslims who go to Medjugorje. The population of Bosnia-Herzegovina is 50% Muslim, and Muslims who visit Medjugorje report grown closer to God too. In any event, the church has now recognized that spiritual fruit can be connected with an apparition, even if the apparition itself is not of supernatural origin. That's why spiritual fruits is still listed among the positive criteria in the new norms, even though the new norms are not directed at establishing that an apparition is supernatural. As Cardinal Fernandez explained in his introductory letter to the new norms,
a nihil obstat allows the pastors of the church to act confidently and promptly to stand among the people of God in welcoming the Holy Spirit's gifts that may emerge in the midst of these events. The phrase, "in the midst of," used in the new norms, clarifies that even if the event itself is not declared to be of supernatural origin, there is still a recognition of the signs of the Holy Spirit's supernatural action in the midst of what is occurring.
I know that this change comes as a disappointment to many fans of particular apparitions. For years, they have appealed to the fact that what they perceived as the spiritual fruit of an apparition was proof of its supernaturality. But the fact is that it isn't, as we heard Cardinal Ratzinger point out last episode, and I think that this is a helpful insight in the new norms. I thus happily acknowledge the abundant spiritual fruit connected with Medjugorje, including that which listeners may have had, but I reluctantly conclude that this is not proof that it is supernatural.
The fourth claim was that the seers of Medjugorje are morally upright and psychologically sound individuals. What do you make of that?
Here is what Miravalli has to say on this subject earlier in his part of the book.
The 6 Medjugorje visionaries have been under the public microscope for most of their adolescent and adult lives. They have been interviewed by a countless number of bishops, priests, religious theologians, and laity. The overwhelming consensus of public opinion for those who have had direct contact with these 6 visionaries is a profound respect for their manifest integrity, straightforwardness, and the down-to-earth approach to the Christian life and to their experience as visionaries. Theologians who have interviewed the visionaries have likewise concluded to the same obvious presence of moral integrity and personal authenticity. Remarkable personal sacrifice rather than personal gain has been the foremost experience of these 6 people, often at the painful expense of personal privacy and hardship. Daily talks to pilgrims, prayer groups, and healing prayer sessions have been the benchmark of life for the majority of the Medjugorje seers for the last 26 years.
So that's a positive case for the moral uprightness and psychological soundness of the seers. However, there is another side to this that Miravalli is not sharing with the reader. In fact, there have been significant questions raised about the moral lives of the visionaries. In his book, The Vatican Prophecies, journalist John Thavis writes,
Mirjana, who is married with 2 daughters, today runs a pilgrim's guest house near her home that provides much-needed income for her family and gives visitors a chance to speak at length with the visionary. At least 2 of the other Medjugorje seers also manage accommodation facilities for visitors. While some have criticized this as a conflict of interest, no one in the town considers it strange, as virtually every family here has profited from the pilgrim boom by adding guest rooms or building hotels. For critics, another telltale sign was the conflict that initially occurred between the Franciscan pastors and the seers over the location of the apparitions. At Father Zavko's insistence, the visionaries agreed to conduct the apparitions in St. James Church at a designated hour. From the Franciscans' point of view, relocating the apparitions into the church not only gave them more control over the visionaries, but also diffused a security issue. The communist authorities were harassing the thousands of faithful who were gathering to witness the apparitions in Podbrdo, but were less likely to object if the events took place within a place of worship. This relocation struck some Marian experts as strangely manipulative, a suspicion that was only reinforced when, in later years, the seers would effectively take Mary with them on tours around the globe. Unlike her previous apparitions in church history, Mary was no longer choosing where and when to appear, but was being stage managed by visionaries and priests.
So it has been argued that the seers display signs of what could be considered evidence of a search for profit or gain strictly connected to the event, in the words of the 1978 norms, or an overt pursuit of profit, power, fame, social recognition, or other personal interests closely linked to the event, in the words of the 2024 norms. Both of those are listed among the negative criteria for both sets of norms. And when it comes to the ruling on Medjugorje itself, the very first paragraph of the document goes out of its way to say this.
It is important to clarify from the outset that the conclusions of this note do not imply a judgment about the moral life of the alleged visionaries. Additionally, when recognizing an action of the Spirit for the good of the people of God in the midst of a spiritual experience, present from its beginnings until now, we should remember that the charismatic gifts that may be connected to that experience do not necessarily require those involved to have moral perfection.
So the document itself is warning us that there may be grounds for criticism of the moral lives of the visionaries. Furthermore, even if someone is morally upright and psychologically sound, that doesn't mean that they're having genuinely supernatural experiences. Morally upright, psychologically sound individuals can have experiences that are due to imagination, for example. Between that and the fact that the DDF itself acknowledges potential criticisms of the seer's moral lives, I don't see this as providing significant positive evidence for the apparitions being supernatural.
What about the third claim that there are healings associated with Medjugorje?
This is also true. In fact, the DDF document notes,
numerous healings have also been reported in connection with Medjugorje.
I like this fact because if someone is supernaturally healed and if it's directly connected and a product of the apparition, then that is evidence that something supernatural or at least paranormal is happening. But there are two problems here. First, as John Thavis points out,
many miraculous healings have been claimed at Medjugorje, though none of them have been officially verified and recognized by the Catholic Church, a point often noted by critics.
So this isn't like the Grotto at Lourdes, where they have church authorities commissioning careful scientific studies of reported healings and validating them. We thus do have miracle reports at Medjugorje, but not verified miracles, which is, all the DDF says. There are a lot of reports. Second, just because a healing occurs in connection with an apparition doesn't mean that it's a product of the apparition. This is the same as the spiritual fruits issue. If you have 40 or 50 million people undertaking a religious exercise, then you will have reports of healing. With that number of people involved, you will have spontaneous remissions happening for purely natural reasons, and you'll have gradual natural healings that occur over time, like with Daniel Sitka, who we heard about last episode. And you'll have the placebo or self-healing or self-healing psychological factors involved that will produce improvement. And you'll have people reaching out to God and asking for a miracle. And when people do that, God will heal some of them. What we'd actually need to see for this to count as significant evidence for supernaturality is careful studies verifying an anomalous number of healings and linking them directly to the apparitions. But we don't have that. I thus like this as a criterion that could be evidence of supernaturality, but in this case, it also doesn't provide significant evidence for it due to the lack of the needed studies.
What about claim number 2, that the seers experience verified ecstasies? You mentioned that this is not one of the criteria that the church actually uses. Why is that?
Because a lot of things can produce ecstasies, at least in part, that's why. An ecstasy is basically a state of intense concentration in which a person is having a subjective mental experience, but a lot of things can produce that, like auto-hypnosis, also known as self-hypnosis. We discussed hypnosis back in episode 52, and in that episode, we covered the question of whether hypnosis is truly an altered state of consciousness or just a social role. Historically, I've favored the idea that it's likely a social role, though I'm open to revising that view. However, even if it's a social role, that doesn't mean people can't have an intense state of concentration with a subjective mental experience produced by their imagination. So I think auto-hypnosis exists regardless of its particular nature, and it could produce trances. Furthermore, I'm aware of the broader history of research regarding ecstasies. For example, when psychical research began in the 1800s, one of the big questions everyone was interested in is whether trance mediums, like Leonora Piper and others, were really in trances. So early psychical researchers would have the mediums go into a trance, and then they would test the trance by doing things like sticking pins into the medium's flesh or pouring acid on the medium's skin and seeing if the medium reacted. If the medium didn't react, then they would conclude that the trance was genuine. And they took that as a sign that the medium might not be a fraud. I've always thought this was a stupid and unnecessary test. First, people don't need to be in a trance to have psychic functioning. And second, the medium might be in a state of auto-hypnosis that allows them to ignore such injuries. Or third, they might just be good fakers who can avoid reacting at the moment. So this is a largely useless test. I'm also not surprised that some of the mediums, like Leonora Piper, got sick of this treatment, because even if it didn't hurt them while they were in the trance, the wounds would hurt them when they came out of it, and some of them got sick of what the researchers were doing to them and refused to be tested that way in the future. In any event, proving that someone is really in a trance doesn't prove that they are genuinely talking to the spirits of the dead or that they're genuinely talking to the Virgin Mary. And so this is not one of the Church's positive criteria for an apparition. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that it's completely irrelevant. I don't think a seer needs to go into an ecstasy to speak with the Virgin Mary, and if a particular seer's revelation occurs in a trance, and if there is evidence that the trance doesn't have natural causes, then that could be support and evidence for supernaturality.
Then let's consider the case of the Medjugorje seer's ecstasies. Does the book we've been quoting from discuss that further?
Here's what Miravalli had to say.
2 medical teams, one from Milan and the other from renowned French University of Montpellier, have scientifically examined the visionaries during the time of reported apparitions. Each has independently validated the legitimacy of their state of ecstasy as being in some form of true communication outside of their ordinary time-space experience. These scientific studies also ruled out any possibility of collective hallucination, and by deduction, any form of mere human deception of falsification.
I totally agree that there is no collective hallucination involved in the apparitions, because collective hallucinations don't appear to exist. That's just a charge that gets made, but there's no scientific evidence for collective hallucinations. So I'm definitely on board with that. And I was glad to see that Miravalli included a footnote documenting the claim of scientific examination. The footnote pointed to an article by James Paul Pandarakalam called Are the Apparitions of Medjugorje Real? In the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And I know the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's an open access journal published by the Society for Scientific Exploration, and the journal publishes a lot of articles on paranormal subjects, including psychic research and UFOs and other things. So I looked up the article, and we'll have a link to it so you can read it for yourself.
What did you make of the article when you read it?
Well, I thought it was very interesting. It was actually a summary article of research done by different people rather than a new study, and it had some very interesting stuff in it, but I wish the author had cross-examined his own material, which he didn't do sufficiently to my mind. I noticed a number of flaws in the piece, and I won't go through them all, but here's a sampling of what I noticed. First, a lot of what he takes as fact is based on self-reporting by the visionaries. For example, if they say that they can't hear or see something during the apparition, he just accepts that. But you can't just accept self-reported data in that way in proof-oriented research, which is what this is, since it's trying to prove that something that paranormal is happening in Medjugorje. One reason is that self-reported data is subjective and therefore not completely reliable. For example, if someone is in a state of intense concentration, like autohypnosis, they may not see and hear things they otherwise would. The author says that there's no evidence of intense concentration before the visions, but there is rhythmic collective action before the visions, namely the communal prayers that the visionaries and others are saying together before the apparition manifests. So that itself is going to involve concentration and communal rhythmic behavior that could promote a hypnosis-like state. And there most definitely is intense concentration during the visions. So I don't consider the auto-hypnosis possibility ruled out. A bigger reason for doubt is that self-reported data is wide open to fraud. People can just lie about what they can and can't see and hear. But the author devotes basically no attention to the possibility of fraud in this case. He doesn't ask the question, could these effects be produced by fraud, and then rule that out. He just seems to ignore the issue of possible fraud. He also seems to ignore potential natural explanations that seem obvious. For example, he notes that when the apparition is reported to begin, the seers kneel down together. And he notes that they do so at slightly different times, and that usually the first seer to start moving is Ivanka. But he fails to consider the possibility that this is all just natural, that whether or not the seers are committing fraud, they just know that they're supposed to kneel together. And so when one of them starts to kneel, usually Ivanka, then the others do too. He's also relying on some outdated science, which isn't surprising since the piece came out in 2001, nearly a quarter century ago. For example, he thinks that different people have different general predilections regarding particular sensory modalities. Some people are more visual, some are more auditory, and some are more kinesthetic or oriented towards physical motion. And this is something that you often hear in learning theory, that some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, and some people are kinesthetic learners. But these claims are scientifically unsupported and in some cases contradicted by data. We don't have evidence that people are divided up this way. And we'll have a link to an article from the Association for Psychological Science called Learning Styles Debunked, so you can read about that. It thus insignificant that he finds signs of the Medjugorje visionaries having a visual orientation, because everyone with sight has that. And given the small number of seers studied, between 3 and 5, because some of the seers no longer have daily visions, the law of small numbers could result in them having a visual orientation even if such a cognitive style existed. Finally, Pandarakalam betrays signs of being a motivated author. That is, he wants to believe, and so he reads evidence to favor his views. For example, in the conclusion of the article, he says this:
the stronger motivation on the part of the apparition, compared with percipience, collective percipience, and quasi-physical features of the apparition, and the limitless loving capacity of the apparition, point toward a true apparitional occurrence at Medjugorje.
Whoa, the limitless loving capacity of the apparition points to a true apparitional experience? This paper hadn't done anything to establish that the apparition has a limitless capacity for love. In fact, the word love doesn't appear anywhere in the paper. And even if it had been established that the reported apparition has a limitless loving capacity, in contrast to the occasional peevishness and threatening nature noted by the DDF, that wouldn't rule out the possibility of imagination or fraud. So while this paper has some interesting stuff in it, I consider it at best weak evidence that has not been sufficiently cross-examined. I'd also make 2 further points regarding the ecstasies or trances of the seers. First, a particularly interesting event occurred on January 14th, 1985. On this day, one of the devotees of Medjugorje, a man named Jean-Louis Martin, was present at an apparition. Martin was a Frenchman who had recently quit his job and moved to Medjugorje to be close to the visionaries. But he had begun to have doubts. So he decided to make an impromptu test of the seer's ecstasy. He therefore spread his first 2 fingers and poked them in the direction of Vika's eyes, kind of like in the Three Stooges. As a supporter of Medjugorje, Martin presumably hoped that she would have no reaction. But she did. She blinked and jerked her head backwards from his hand. After the apparition, Vika came back into the room and explained that she had moved because she had wanted to catch the baby Jesus, who she was afraid the Virgin Mary was about to drop. It was just a coincidence that this happened at the same time that Martin tested her. Now, I'm not sure how she knew about Martin's test if she was in a trance, but I suppose someone could have told her about it while she was out of the room. But this is quite suspicious. Reportedly, Martin himself was disappointed, because why did she move backwards if she was trying to catch the baby Jesus who was supposed to be in front of her? Martine reportedly left Medjugorje the next day. Also, why would the Virgin Mary drop baby Jesus? That sounds suspicious. And frankly, if I were faking an apparition, I could come up with a better lie than that. I'd say I had no memory of the fingers being poked towards my eyes or of jerking my head back, but I guess Mary was just looking out for me and caused me to do that while I was having the vision. Or, maybe I did subconsciously perceive the fingers coming towards my eyes because my eyes are still biologically working, and that caused me subconsciously to blink my eyes and jerk my head back on instinct. But this just never made it up into my conscious mind because my conscious mind was filled up with the vision. Well, we're fortunate from an evidential point of view that this moment was captured on film by a Canadian parapsychologist named Louis Ballinger. It happened very quickly, and Vika didn't jerk back much, but it does happen. And we're going to play a clip for viewers of the video version of the podcast. First, though, I should explain that you can't see Jean-Louis Martine in the frame, which is focused on the faces of the visionaries. You can only see his hand quickly poke into the frame. However, he's the bearded gentleman standing off camera with a woman, and there's footage of him reenacting the test and demonstrating how he poked his fingers. In any event, here's the Ballinger footage.
Ballinger set up his camera and sat back to watch.
Now, they make the sign of the cross, and they begin the prayer, Our Father, and during that prayer, suddenly there is the beginning of the ecstasy. They kneel down and they are in contact with the Virgin Mary.
If they're truly in ecstasy, nothing should distract the children. But suddenly, to Ballinger's later amazement, an onlooker called Jean-Louis jabbed his hand towards Vitska on the right.
At the moment of filming, I did not see that. Just afterwards, I saw that there was a commotion in the chapel. And everybody was disturbed because Vitska had reacted. Jean-Louis made a threat gesture against the eyes of Vitska, towards the eyes of Vitska, and she reacted. And it was for Jean-Louis an important disappointment.
Still frames from Ballinger's video at the moment of the hand lunging at Vitska show her clearly recoiling from the jabbing fingers.
Then the fingers of Jean-Louis are going back. Still no reaction from Vitska. A slight reaction, closing of her eyes. And then on the next picture, you have the spectacular movement of the face of Vitska. She is reacting, going back. After the ecstasy, I had forgotten to stop the camera, and suddenly Vitska comes in with somebody else.
She wanted to explain why she'd moved. In her trance, she'd been trying to prevent the Virgin from dropping the infant Jesus.
So she said, when I arrived in the chapel, and everything was okay. When the ecstasy began, I saw nobody, and I heard nobody, except the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary had the infant Jesus in her arms. And suddenly, I thought, said Vitska, that the infant Jesus would fall on the floor. So to impeach that, I made a gesture to impeach the infant Jesus to fall on the floor. And she thought that it would explain the reaction that she had against the threat gesture made by Jean-Louis.
So it's a very quick movement, but Vika really does jerk her head back when Martine makes a sudden gesture toward her eyes. Personally, I find the idea that she was just by total coincidence trying to stop Mary from dropping the baby Jesus to be implausible. And this incident raises significant questions about the studies that we heard about earlier that purported to show that the seers were in a trance, which, as we heard, were significantly flawed in part because The summary article was relying on subjective reporting by the seers. And for the second point I mentioned, we also have the testimony from Dr. Giorgio Gagliardi, who is an Italian with expertise in psychophysiology and states of consciousness. So he's actually trained in this field. And he concluded that it was doubtful that the seers were experiencing the kind of ecstasies that they claimed. He further showed that the reported ecstasies did not seem to be triggered by the manifestation of an external factor, like the Virgin Mary arriving at the appointed time. He did this by separating the visionaries and setting the clocks in the rooms they were in to different times. This resulted in the visionaries having their ecstasies at different times, even though they supposedly were all doing it at the same time. And we'll have a link to where you can read about that. In light of all this, I don't think that I can assign significant evidential weight to the claim that the seers are in verifiable trances.
Then that leaves us with the first claim that the messages of Medjugorje are doctrinally orthodox. What do you make of this as evidence for supernaturality?
Let's start with Miravalli's assessment of the situation. He says,
"The messages of Medjugorje do not contain a single doctrinal teaching that runs contrary to authentic Catholic magisterial teaching. On the contrary, the Medjugorje messages present in its most fundamental themes the gospel message of Jesus Christ for faith, prayer, fasting, conversion, and peace, as we were also expounded upon by the fathers of the Church. At the same time, the messages convey a contemporary formulation of Catholic teachings which profoundly parallels the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar teachings of the Papal Magisterium. Not only do the messages of Medjugorje conform completely to the Church's official teachings, but they reflect the most current expression of the Church's teachings with its emphasis on issues precisely such as ecumenism and the contemporary Church mission of authentic Christian unity."
I'd say that in broad outlines, this is correct. The DDF did note that there are certain messages from Medjugorje that need to be taken in a special way or that need to be set aside entirely, which is why they issued the section on what they called necessary clarifications. But in broad strokes, I'd say Miravalli is correct in what he says.
Does that provide us with positive evidence for the supernaturality of the apparitions?
No, not really. Doctrinal orthodoxy is a positive criterion the Church uses when evaluating apparitions, but it's positive in the sense that it doesn't rule out the apparition. If an apparition's message were fundamentally unorthodox, then you could rule it out as inauthentic or even demonic. And there have been apparitions that were ruled out in this way. For example, back in the 1960s in Southern California, there was a woman named Frances Klug who founded an organization called St. Joseph's Hill of Hope, City of God. She reported having divine revelations and wrote a series of volumes called Stories from Heaven. One of the things she reported learning from her revelations was that St. Joseph was not just the foster father of Jesus, but he was actually God himself, a divine person, either a fourth person of the Holy Trinity or the Father or the Spirit or something. When this came to the attention of church authorities, these apparitions were jointly condemned by the bishops of Los Angeles, Orange, California, and San Bernardino, California, on the grounds that they were heretical. So if an apparition's messages violate church teaching, that's a sign it isn't supernatural. And in that sense, it's a positive sign if the messages are orthodox. But mere orthodoxy is not positive evidence that something is supernatural. Anyone with a basic knowledge of the faith can produce orthodox texts. If I wanted to commit fraud to produce an apparition, I guarantee I could produce a body of texts that were 100% orthodox. Or if, as a devout Catholic, I innocently imagined that the Virgin Mary was appearing to me, then I would imagine orthodox messages coming from her. So mere orthodoxy is not positive evidence of supernaturality.
Not everybody is Jimmy Akin, though. Not everybody has the level of knowledge about the faith that you do. Is there a situation in which Orthodox messages could be evidence for supernaturality?
Yes, but you'd have to have good evidence that the person fundamentally lacked the knowledge of the faith needed to produce the messages in question, and that they were not being fed the messages by someone who did have that knowledge. And in that case, it would be reasonable to propose that they were getting the message from a supernatural source. Like if you had a 4-year-old child whose parents don't even believe and who has no contact with anyone theologically knowledgeable, who nevertheless suddenly starts explaining the circumcision or mutual indwelling of the persons of the Trinity and using the correct terminology. I mean, that would be impressive and suggestive of the supernatural if you could verify all that stuff. But that's not what we have here. The Medjugorje seers were all in their late teens when the apparition started, with the exception of one who was 10 years old. And they didn't come out the gate espousing complex doctrinal concepts. The concepts they taught, especially at the beginning, were basic, and they largely remain basic today. And since then, they have lived in the world of religion full time. So they would naturally grow in their understanding of the faith over the last 43 years. And thus, even if they were teaching complex doctrinal ideas today, it wouldn't show that they were of supernatural origin. I just don't see this as positive evidence for the messages being supernatural.
We've now gone through the claims presented in the book. Are the Medjugorje apparitions authentic? Are there any other arguments we should consider?
There is one. Miravalle doesn't include it in his case, and I agree with that decision. But it's an argument that's out there, and I know some people will wonder about it. Earlier, we discussed healings in connection with Medjugorje, but there are other miracles that have been reported. For example, some people report having their rosary beads turn gold. Some people report smelling roses, and some report seeing the sun dance, like at Fatima. But there are problems with each of these. In the first place, none of these miracles have been authenticated by church authorities, so they haven't been tested. And in the second place, they are susceptible of natural explanations. For example, when it comes to rosary beads, here's an account from one pilgrim.
Well, I had heard about this happening. I certainly never expected it, but just as we started to say the rosary, I noticed that the metal parts, in between the beads, had turned color. And I thought, at first, maybe it was my imagination, but my husband looked, and he said, yes, it was metal before. And now, I don't know what it is, but it looks like the gold color.
Unfortunately, this can have a purely natural explanation. I have had rosaries before where the links between the beads are metal that has been plated. They may look silver on the outside, but there is a metal with copper in it, like bronze or brass, underneath. And over time, the outer plating can wear off through friction as the links in the chain brush against each other as you finger the beads, or as the rosary gets squished around in your pocket, or the plating might get corroded by the weather or by the acid in sweat. Then, as one of 50 million rosary-praying pilgrims going to Medjugorje, you happen to look down and notice that the bronze or brass has been exposed as the plating wore off, and it looks to you like the rosary has just turned gold. With that many pilgrims going to Medjugorje, that's going to happen to some of them.
What about smelling roses when you don't see any roses nearby?
Well, maybe roses are nearby and you just didn't see them. Or maybe there's another flower that you smelled, a floral scent, and you interpreted it as roses. Or maybe a priest was using a certain kind of incense, or a woman was wearing perfume, or maybe a man was smoking pipe tobacco that had floral elements in its aroma. And I should note that they smoke really heavily in Europe, and especially Bosnia-Herzegovina, where tobacco is one of the major local crops. In fact, some of the Medjugorje seers worked in the tobacco fields as children. Or, since smells are subjective experiences, maybe you just imagined the aroma since you might associate it with Mary and thought Mary is here.
What about seeing the miracle of the sun? That was also reported at Fatima in 1917.
Yes, but what happened at Fatima was quite different. A crowd of about 70,000 people saw the sun behave unusually at the same time and on just one occasion. We talked about the miracle of the sun in episode 40, so you can go back and listen to that for more information. But that's not what's reported at Medjugorje. In fact, in his book, Medjugorje, The Last Apparition, Wayne Weibel has this to say.
It took a stupendous visible sign to convince the masses that the mother of Jesus was truly appearing in Fatima. That sign would be the first recorded miracle of the sun, which occurred often in Medjugorje in the early days and continues to happen today. However, it was far more than what is seen in Medjugorje and lasted much longer.
So even a supporter of Medjugorje like Weibel admits that the miracle of the sun at Fatima was much more dramatic than what's reported at Medjugorje. Similarly, John Thavis explains,
the most common supernatural sign supposedly witnessed at Medjugorje has been the spinning sun, in which the solar disk pulsates and changes color. It requires that the faithful stare at the sun for an extended period of time, a practice that remains quite common among pilgrims despite the real risk of retinal damage. The visual illusion of a sun that appears to throb and dance in the sky has been attributed to retinal distortion and other physiological changes caused by sun gazing. But Medjugorje followers dismiss scientific explanations. For them, it's a God-given wonder and a reminder of the miracle of the sun that reportedly occurred during Marian apparitions in Fatima, Portugal on October 13, 1917. While the Fatima phenomenon took place only once, before a crowd of nearly 100,000 people, at Medjugorje, the sun miracle is a personal event experienced by individual visitors and occurs virtually on demand.
So with the differences between what the sun did at Fatima and what it's reported to do at Medjugorje, and with there being naturalistic explanations for the latter, I don't consider this to be significant positive evidence for supernaturality. It's more likely a subjective experience, and in any event, none of these reported miracles have been verified. I thus agree with Miravalli for leaving this argument off his list.
Then how would you assess the case for Medjugorje being genuinely supernatural as a whole?
Based on the arguments I've been able to find, I would consider it quite weak. I just don't see positive evidence that all of the experiences reported by the seers for the last 43 years are supernatural. It's not that they can't be, it's just I don't see strong evidence that they are. But now it's time to look at the other side of the issue, the arguments against Medjugorje being supernatural, and I'm not going to go easy on them either, because it's by rigorously testing both sides that we get to the truth.
And before we get to those arguments, we'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Levi S., Jonathan H., Leah H., Christian G., and Brock R. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by the debut novel Pilgrims by M.R. Leonard, Alien Invasion, the Catholic Church, and a failed Latin teacher. Pilgrims is inspired by Augustine's Confessions and tells the story of a washed-up Latin teacher who gets thrust into the center of humanity's first contact with extraterrestrials who land at the Vatican and claim to be Catholic. Mysterious World fans who enjoy compelling science fiction from a Catholic point of view can find Pilgrims wherever books are sold and at mrleonardauthor.com. And for those who enjoy audiobooks, Pilgrims is also available as a full multicast production. This StarQuest show is also brought to you by Exodus 90 and the Exodus 90 app. Men, we are called to share the hope and joy of Jesus Christ. Our family, friends, and community desperately need us to imitate our Lord to be radically present and available. What if you intentionally live this Advent season differently? Focused not on buying Christmas presents, but sharing the loving presence of Jesus Christ. We want to invite you to join us on the Exodus 90 app and break out of the religion of the world. Join the men of Exodus 90 and Monsignor James Shea, president of the University of Mary, who's our spiritual guide for Advent this year on the Exodus 90 app. Together, we will rediscover the hope that God lays out for us in the coming of His Son into the world. Go to exodus90.com/SQPN to learn more about Advent on the Exodus 90 app. That's exodus90.com/SQPN to join men from around the world this Advent starting December 1st. Be radically free in Jesus Christ this Advent. So how do you want to proceed in looking at arguments against Medjugorje being supernatural?
Well, basically by doing the same thing we did in the previous section of the show, identifying a source that provides a good summary of many of the arguments, going through it, and then dealing with any remaining arguments that the source didn't list. It so happens that Cardinal Fernandez had a section in his speech at the press conference where he summarized many of the common arguments against Medjugorje, so we'll be using that. And some good news for me is that he also responded to a lot of these arguments, so we'll be hearing what he had to say, and I'll be adding my own thoughts.
Just so we know where we're going, how would you summarize the arguments that Cardinal Fernandez covered?
Basically, he looked at 10 arguments opponents of Medjugorje have made. 1, the apparition cited with the Franciscans in the Herzegovina affair. 2, priests connected with the visionaries were immoral. 3, the frequency of the messages is problematic. They're too frequent. 4, the Virgin sometimes announced the apparitions in advance. 5, the visions contained unorthodox syncretism or indifferentism. 6, the insistence on listening to the messages is problematic, especially when Our Lady gives orders about things that should be discerned in community. 7, some messages contain statements that are imprecise. 8, none of the visionaries have become priests or sisters. 9, the children have not displayed heroic virtue. And 10, that the lives of the children were not exemplary.
Then let's look at each of these one at a time. What about the 10th claim that the lives of the children were not exemplary?
Here's how Cardinal Fernandez handles this challenge.
Some indicated that the lives of the children were not exemplary, and they said so by recounting certain details such as the fact that in the period before the first apparition, one of the girls smoked, raising suspicion that she had stolen cigarettes from her father.
So I told you, I mentioned 2 weeks ago that the fact Ivanka and Mirjana had reportedly gone walking to listen to rock music and smoke cigarettes would play a role. But frankly, I'm not impressed by this argument. In the first place, smoking in moderation is not a sin, as the Catechism indicates, and smoking is a big part of the local culture. Smoking against your parents' instructions, not to, would be a sin, but I don't know that their parents had told them not to. And stealing cigarettes would be a sin, but I don't know that that happened either. All Cardinal Fernandez says is that some had a suspicion that she might have stolen cigarettes, but suspicion isn't proof. Maybe she bought them, or maybe someone gave them to her. Even if the girls were guilty of both of these sins, though, they would be venial, and even true visionaries have venial sins. Furthermore, we're dealing with the visionaries at the beginning of the reported apparitions, and here I agree wholeheartedly with Mark Miravalli. In Are the Medjugorje Apparitions Authentic, he writes,
The Church grants the possibility that God could choose, in His mysterious ways, someone to receive a heavenly message who could be far from Christ or from the Church, and then to experience conversion as a result of the supernatural intervention. Therefore, it is an authentic moral goodness from the beginning of the reported apparitions, and not so much their past lives, that commission members of church investigations look for as essential in evaluating the basic conditions for a possible recipient of heavenly visits or messages.
I agree with Miravalli here 100%. For me, the greatest illustration of this is St. Paul. He was on his way to Damascus to arrest and persecute Christians and have some of them put to death when Jesus appeared to him and converted him. So you can be a colossal sinner and still get a revelation from God.
But St. Paul converted and lived a holy Christian life. What about the behavior of people after they've gotten messages from heaven? Have there been concerns raised about the Medjugorje seers following the start of the visions?
There have. Cardinal Fernandez remarks,
Critics also emphasize the fact that the young people acknowledged that they had lied twice, once to keep a message that they considered to be private, and once under pressure from Father Vlasic. They acknowledged that this was the only time Father Vlasic managed to pressure any of the young people against their will.
So here the cardinal refers to two instances where the seers admitted telling a lie. I believe that the first case involved a situation where the bishop was planning to split a local parish, which displeased the Franciscans. In late 1981 and 1982, so early in Phase 2, the Virgin Mary allegedly gave Vica messages supporting the Franciscans against the bishop. On January 15, 1982, the bishop asked the seers if they'd received any messages on this matter, and they said no. So I think this is what Cardinal Fernandez is referring to when he says that they once lied, keeping back a message they regarded as private. But they then fessed up on April 3rd and admitted that they did have messages on this matter. The second case, which took place in 1987, involved one of the priests associated with the seers, Father Tomislav Vlasic. He had founded a community in Parma, Italy. The community was called Queen of Peace, Totally Yours, to Jesus Through Mary. They love long names in Europe, including at the DDF. They really give long names to documents. But the seer Maria claimed that the Virgin Mary had endorsed this community, saying it was God's plan. Maria also was a member of the community at the time, but she soon left and retracted the message endorsing the community, saying that she had been pressured by Father Vlasic into issuing the endorsement.
What do you make of these incidents as evidence against the supernaturality of Medjugorje?
Well, there's certainly not positive signs in favor of supernaturality, but I don't consider them decisive against it. Yes, the young people admitted lying in two cases, and there's a natural tendency to say falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus, or false in one thing, false in everything, but that's not true. People who receive revelations retain free will, and it's possible for them to tell lies using their free will, especially in situations where they feel pressured, like in revelations that they thought were private but could get them in hot water if they reveal them, or revelations where someone was openly pressuring them to make an endorsement. And then there's the redemptive factor that they fessed up. So in view of all this, I don't think these two cases of admitted lies under pressure offer proof of non-supernaturality in general. Just like I don't think that it's proof that everything a person says is a lie if they admit to you they've told two. You know, just take it out of a visionary context. People occasionally tell lies, and that doesn't mean everything they say is a lie. It's a positive sign if you can show that they have no documented cases of lying and that they stuck to their story under pressure, but the reverse is not true. So I don't think that their states of life before the apparitions began or having two cases of where they admitted lying are proof of overall non-supernaturality.
What about the number 9 claim that was made, that the seers haven't displayed heroic virtue?
So heroic virtue is what saints need to display in life. It's an intense form of virtue, and it's a necessary qualification to be declared a saint after you die. You may literally be a saint in heaven after you die, but you won't be officially declared a saint unless you displayed heroic virtue in life, because the church wants your earthly life to be an example to others. It wants people to be able to look up to you and follow your example of Christian living. And there is an argument here that the Medjugorje visionaries have not displayed heroic virtue. Maybe they've displayed virtue, but it's not obviously heroic. That's at least hinted at by the passage we heard from earlier in the DDF document, which notes that they are not passing any judgment on the moral character of the visionaries. But here is how Cardinal Fernandez responds to this criticism.
It is not necessarily the case that people who receive charismatic gifts or messages must exercise the virtues to a heroic degree. This is required for beatification, and when beatifying someone, there is a very important criterion. Beatification does not imply recognizing as authentic the alleged supernatural phenomena experienced by that person. Both of these things must be separated. Even in the case where there is a declaration of supernatural origin, this does not offer any certainty as to the holiness of the person. They are two different things because, as the note explains, when recognizing an action of the Spirit for the good of the people of God in the midst of spiritual experience, present from its beginning until now, we should remember that the charismatic gifts that may be connected to that experience do not necessarily require those involved to have moral perfection. The fact is that if a person has a charism, for example a charism of healing, when they fall prey to sin, they do not lose that charism, and they continue to heal. Certainly in some cases, out of prudence, the Church may prohibit the exercise of a charism because there exists a grave risk of scandal or an improper use of the charism.
And I agree with the Cardinal 100%. People can have charisms, including private revelation, without displaying heroic virtue, and you can also display heroic virtue without having miraculous gifts. They are two separate things that must be looked at separately. I also like that the Cardinal notes that even people who have fallen into sin can continue to use charismatic gifts like healing. That certainly seems confirmed by St. Paul's discussion of charismatic gifts in 1 Corinthians 12-14, where he flat out tells the Corinthians that they're abusing the gift of speaking in tongues. He doesn't say they're not speaking in tongues, that it has ceased to be real among them. Instead, he tells them they're using it in a sinful way, a way they shouldn't. So it's certainly true that just because a person doesn't display a heroic virtue, it doesn't mean that they're not having genuinely supernatural experiences like private apparitions. I thus don't think that this objection is any kind of proof against the supernaturality of Medjugorje.
What about claim number 8, that none of the visionaries have pursued a vocation to the priesthood or religious life?
So there have been previous approved apparitions where visionaries did pursue a vocation like this. For example, the visionary of Lourdes, St. Bernadette Soubirous, became a member of the Sisters of Charity. The surviving visionary of Fatima, Lucia dos Santos, became a discalced Carmelite, and the visionary at Akita, Sister Agnes Sasagawa, was already a sister in the Handmaids of the Holy Eucharist. The logic behind this objection would be that if the Virgin Mary starts talking to you, it should lead you to grow closer to God. And one of the ways of doing that is by consecrating your life to Him through vocation, either as a priest, a monk, or a sister, so that you can live out a life of special consecration. But Cardinal Fernandez responds that visionary experiences do not necessarily have to be connected to the religious life, and I agree with that. One of the things about vocations is they must be freely accepted. That's true whether it's a vocation to marriage, the ordained life, or the religious life. Whenever God offers a person a particular vocation, it's an invitation to serve Him and do good in the world in a particular way. But just like you can't be married against your will, as the Princess Bride taught us, you must freely choose it. So vocations to ordination or religious vows must also be freely accepted. As a result, this is another free will decision, and just because you don't have to display heroic virtue to have visionary experiences, you also don't have to become a priest or a sister. In fact, there have been apparitions that I'm convinced were not supernatural, where some did embrace a vocation. Specifically, for the reasons I discussed in episode 60, I think that La Salette was not a supernatural apparition. It was approved at the time, but we know more now than we did then, and in hindsight, it looks non-supernatural. Well, one of the two seers from that, Melanie Calvat, did become a religious sister. In fact, she passed through several different religious orders and had a troubled career as a sister. So I don't think that vocations or the lack of them provide proof one way or another. When vocations are present, it doesn't prove that the apparitions were supernatural, and when vocations are absent, it also doesn't prove that they're not.
What about claim number 7, that some of the messages of Medjugorje contain imprecise statements?
Well, that's true. In fact, the document authorizing the nihil obstat for Medjugorje had a whole section on messages that needed to be understood carefully because they could be misleading. And in the press conference, Cardinal Fernandez gave another example.
There are also a few messages that can contain phrases that are not precise from an academic point of view, phrases certainly not from St. Thomas Aquinas. For example, there has been criticism of a message in which it says that the deceased feel joy when Mass is offered for them. It is a popular language, poetic and existential, not purely theological. If someone looks at it with a magnifying glass, they come to say that this means that there is no condemned person, or that one cannot speak of joy if the deceased are in purgatory.
However, the cardinal goes on to say,
it is another language that ultimately conveys a very Catholic conviction that it is good and beautiful to pray for our dead, and that this act of charity is worth more than our sadness at their death.
I'd go even further than that. If I imagine myself being in purgatory and I learn that someone on earth is saying a Mass for me, I imagine I would feel joy. It means I'm going to get out of here sooner. Further, it's part of the Catholic tradition to hold that there is happiness in purgatory. You know, it's not necessarily a major part of the tradition, but it is there. In fact, St. Catherine of Genoa, a canonized saint, writes about the souls having joy in purgatory. In her treatise on purgatory, she writes,
I believe no happiness can be found worthy to be compared with that of a soul in purgatory, except that of the saints in paradise. And day by day, this happiness grows as God flows into these souls more and more as the hindrance to his entrance is consumed. Sin's rust is the hindrance, and the fire burns the rust away, so that more and more the soul opens itself up to the divine inflowing. A thing which is covered cannot respond to the sun's rays, not because of any defect in the sun, which is shining all the time, but because the cover is an obstacle. If the cover be burnt away, this thing is open to the sun. More and more, as the cover is consumed, does it respond to the rays of the sun. It is in this way that rust, which is sin, covers souls, and in purgatory is burnt away by fire. The more it is consumed, the more do the souls respond to God, the true sun. As the rust lessens and the soul is opened up to the divine ray, happiness grows. Treatise on Purgatory, Chapter 2.
So I have no problem saying that souls in purgatory feel joy when people on earth say masses for them. But there's a more fundamental issue that the cardinal goes on to address.
On the other hand, we must remember that when there are spiritual experiences of different kinds, there is no dictation. Our Lady does not say, repeat or write word for word what I tell you. The person perceives a content and makes an effort to remember it and express it as best he can, and he may not find the most suitable words for it. So, this means that these supposed messages should not be read as if they were a magisterial text, a piece of academic theology or catechism. One must grasp the core, the deeper thought behind the imperfection of the words. Moreover, the note recalls a decisive principle. When one recognizes the action of the Holy Spirit in the midst of a spiritual experience, it does not mean that everything that belongs to that experience is exempt from any imprecision, imperfection, or possible confusion. It should again be recalled that these phenomena at times appear connected to confused human experiences, theologically inaccurate expressions, or interests that are not entirely legitimate. This, therefore, does not exclude the possibility of some error of a natural order not owing to bad intentions, but to the subjective perception of the phenomenon.
So we're not supposed to treat apparitional messages as if they're passages from the gospel. This means two things. First, skeptics cannot simply pounce on an individual statement and declare the apparition non-supernatural. And second, believers cannot simply pounce on an individual statement and declare, Mary says this or Mary wants that. Both skeptics and believers need to read apparitional texts with more nuance than that.
Cardinal Fernandez then goes on to try to steelman this objection. He raises a related objection, which is that given that the Medjugorje messages can be imprecise, it would be better to prohibit them and let people read precise text instead. What do you make of that?
I don't think much of it. In the first place, this isn't just true of Medjugorje. It's true of apparitional messages in general. Yet, God seems to want us to have messages through apparitions. That's why he gives them. So we shouldn't simply dismiss them because they're sometimes theologically imprecise. And the cardinal also goes on to make a devastating response that, to my mind, absolutely crushes this objection. He says,
If we do this, not much would remain to be read even among the spiritual authors, or there would remain only a genre of very precise texts with the consequent impoverishment of the broad spiritual richness of the Church. One would have to forbid, for example, texts by doctors of the Church, such as St. Catherine of Siena, St. Therese of Lisieux, or even St. John of the Cross. Let us give an example. In the poem Living Flame of Love, the Dr. St. John of the Cross describes, follow this reasoning, the center and foundation of the soul as the purest and most intimate substance of it. But he also speaks about the infinite center of the substance of the soul. Here things become complicated, because in what sense would the substance of the soul be infinite? But still more problematic is the fact that he affirms that this center of the soul is God. If one does not interpret them adequately, these texts by the Doctor Saint make one think that the substance of the soul is God himself. Does it seem to you to be precise language that could not cause confusion?
He goes on to cite another example from St. Therese of Lisieux, where she speaks of being confident of becoming a saint, not because of her own merits, for she has none, but because God will clothe her in his infinite merits. Well, doesn't she know that the Council of Trent says that by God's grace we really do acquire merit after God has justified us by cooperating with his grace? Of course she knew that. She's just expressing that truth in a non-academic way. She doesn't have any merits of her own apart from God, but God, who transforms our hearts and enables us to love, is the source of the merits we do have. So even doctors of the Church, like these, can use language that, taken in isolation, can be imprecise and misunderstood. And we have to read their writings more charitably than that to understand what they're actually saying. And if that's true of doctors of the Church, like St. John of the Cross and St. Therese of Lisieux, then we can and should do the same thing for the Medjugorje messages. I thus don't think that imprecise statements give us proof of non-supernatural origin.
What about claim number 6, that in some messages Our Lady insists on us heeding her messages and then goes on to give orders about things that really need to be determined by people here on earth, like bishops and pastors?
Here's how the cardinal articulates that objection. He notes that sometimes messages insist too much on heeding them, and then he says,
The insistence on listening to the messages becomes problematic in some messages, where Our Lady gives orders about dates, places, practicalities, makes decisions about ordinary matters that should be discerned in community.
He responds by saying,
This is the model of Our Lady of the Telegraph reporter that Pope Francis rejects. For example, when she tells what time Mass should be celebrated, or what to do next Advent, or when the Church should celebrate the memory of her birth, we recall the following message, which falls into this category.
This August 5th will mark the celebration of the second millennium of my birth. I ask you to prepare yourselves intensely over 3 days. Do not work on these days.
Although messages of this type are infrequent in this experience of Medjugorje, and some have not even been published, we can find some of them that are explained solely from the personal desires of the alleged visionaries. It is reasonable for the faithful, using prudence and common sense, not to take these details seriously nor heed them. One must always recall that in this spiritual experience, along with positive and edifying elements, there are others that are less important.
And I agree with that. Messages of this sort can involve a human element that is intruding. Not only the 2024 norms, but also the 1978 norms explicitly stated that the seer may intrude something from their own consciousness into the messages they get. Thus, the seers may have thought Mary was asking for something she wasn't, or that she was more insistent about something than she actually was. But once again, skeptics should not pounce on this as proof of non-supernaturality, and believers should not pounce on it as the will of heaven. In any event, this does not give us a proof of a non-supernatural origin.
What about claim number 5, that some of the messages contain contradictory statements or doctrinally unorthodox messages?
Here's how the cardinal handles that charge.
It has also been said that there are contradictory or unorthodox messages about which we have already spoken. But some stopped at denouncing religious syncretism because Our Lady would not have said that all religions are equal. However, the messages on this point, which have a very precious meaning in the context of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, do not affirm this. On the contrary, they say the following: this does not mean that all religions are equal before God, but people are.
What the cardinal is referring to here is a message from May 20th, 1982, where the Virgin Mary spoke about the different religions in Yugoslavia. The message reportedly came when a priest asked why an Orthodox child had been healed, and as it's popularly printed, the message says this:
Tell this priest, tell everyone, that it is you who is divided on earth. The Muslims and the Orthodox, for the same reason as Catholics, are equal before my son and me. You are all my children. This does not mean that all religions are equal before God, but people are. It is not enough, however, to belong to the Catholic Church to be saved. One must respect God's will. To whom little has been given, little will be asked.
Now, as printed, the statement is true. Muslims, Orthodox, and Catholics are all made in the image of God, and so we are all equal before God as human beings. But this does not mean that all religions are equal before God. They're not. From a Catholic point of view, the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith fully corresponds to the will of God, and other religions don't. They only correspond to different degrees. Yet, even being a Catholic is not a ticket to heaven. We have to respect God's will and avoid mortal sin. Meanwhile, as Jesus told us, from those who are given little, little is expected. So if someone, through no fault of their own, has little accurate knowledge of God, then God will not hold them accountable for that fact, and it will be possible for them to be saved. This is actually quite a balanced statement, and it does not teach religious syncretism, which is the combination of ideas from different religions, nor is it religious indifferentism, which is the idea that all religions are equal before God. So far, so good. But there's a problem. While I was researching this episode, I uncovered a claim that this quotation of the message is inaccurate. I won't go into all the details because they're complex, but it appears that the message as printed is a fusion of two different quotations. The first part of the message is reportedly genuine. That part of the message says this:
Tell this priest, tell everyone, that it is you who is divided on earth. The Muslims and the Orthodox, for the same reason as Catholics, are equal before my son and me. You are all my children.
But the words that came after this were originally a commentary on the message by the French author André Castella.
This does not mean that all religions are equal before God, but people are. It is not enough, however, to belong to the Catholic Church to be saved. One must respect God's will. To whom little has been given, little will be asked.
What happened was there was a typo in a book of messages, and if you didn't read closely enough, you'd think that Castella's commentary was part of the message itself. Someone then misread the two passages as if they were part of the same message, and this conflated version or fused version of the messages then got out into the works that collected Medjugorje messages, and so now it's widely reported. So the part that says this does not mean that all religions are equal before God is not part of what the message from Mary said. And this particular quotation is what Cardinal Fernandez was quoting to show that the messages deny syncretism or indifferentism.
Does this fundamentally change things?
Well, there are some very early reported messages that can make it sound like all religions are the same, but there are two problems. First, the documentation of these early messages is very poor because the communist authorities confiscated the records of them, and so there is doubt about whether some of these early messages are genuine. They've kind of been collected from different places, and it's not really certain how historical they all are. Second, there are also reported messages, including from the early phase, that cut in the other direction. For example, one early phase of phase 2. For example, one message is reported to have been given on February 25th, 1982, which is earlier than the one that was accidentally fused. In this case, the Virgin Mary was asked if all religions are good, and the reported message says,
"There is good in all religions, but professing one religion or another is not the same. The Holy Spirit does not act with equal power in all religious communities."
So this one makes the same point as the one that was accidentally expanded, and as Cardinal Fernandez points out, the less clear messages should be read in the light of the more clear ones. So given that, I don't think that we have proof of a non-supernatural origin.
What about claim number 4, that the Medjugorje apparitions come at predictable times that are known in advance?
Here's what Cardinal Fernandez says about that one.
The fact that at times the Virgin announced the apparitions has also been criticized. It is true that the initial events were unexpected, whereas afterwards they were predictable. However, in other apparitions, like at Fatima, there were also indications of the place or time of an apparition.
And that's true. In Sister Lucia's 4th memoir of the events at Fatima, she reports that on May 13th, 1917, the Virgin Mary said this:
"I have come to ask you to come here for 6 months in succession, on the 13th day, at this same hour. Later on, I will tell you who I am and what I want. Afterwards, I will return here yet a 7th time."
So yes, there have been other apparitions where the time that the apparitions would happen was known in advance. I thus don't consider this proof against a supernatural origin for Medjugorje.
What about claim number 3, that the messages are too frequent and have gone on for too long a period of time to be of supernatural origin?
In the book, Are the Apparitions of Medjugorje Authentic? Here is how Mark Miravalli responds to this argument.
The length of the series of a reported apparition event is not one of the valid criteria the Church uses in examining the issue of authenticity. The Holy Spirit blows where He wills, and the Church concentrates on the what issue, the essential elements of message contents, general associated phenomena, and spiritual fruits, rather than the peripheral how long issue.
And this is true. If you read the criteria from the 1978 norms, which were in force at the time, or the 2024 norms that are in force now, you will not find how frequent or how long messages go on for as a negative criterion. Miravalli also says this:
We must be careful not to use incidental criteria, such as the length of the series of the apparitions, as a fundamental reason to validate or invalidate a reported apparition. Keep in mind that the purpose of authentic private revelation is to encourage humanity to live the public revelation of the saving gospel of Jesus Christ in its fullness of Catholic truth and life. If our contemporary humanity is not responding in general to the overall message of Jesus Christ and the Church, then we should not be surprised when we see an unprecedented increase in apparitions and messages from the Mother of God, the Queen of Prophets, to encourage our world to respond to the saving light of Jesus Christ amidst a world commonly admitted to be experiencing unprecedented spiritual and moral darkness. Perhaps gratitude, rather than skepticism, would be the more appropriate response.
Miravalli also seeks to provide a proof by counterexample, right in?
In fact, we do have cases within the Church's mystical tradition where a series of supernatural communications have lasted as long, or even significantly longer than, the more than quarter-century length of the Medjugorje messages. For example, St. Bridget of Sweden, one of the Church's most approved visionaries and mystics, received visions and messages for well over a quarter century. St. Hildegard received visions from her early childhood and consistently from age 15 until her death at 83 for a total of 68 years. St. John Bosco also began receiving visions as a child and continued to have supernatural communications for more than half a century. More recently, St. Pio of Pietrelcina experienced consistent supernatural communications which lasted 50 years, including apparitions, visions, locutions, spiritual transports, and the stigmata. Sister Lucia of Fatima began receiving apparitions at the age of 9 and then proceeded to receive both apparitions and messages for decades after her original 1917 Marian apparitions. It is believed that Sister Lucia continued to receive supernatural communication from Our Lady, which included the supernatural confirmation of the validity of the 1984 world consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary by Pope John Paul II, until shortly before her death in 2005 at the age of 97.
So that's Miravalli's response.
What do you make of it?
Well, I think there is some merit to what he says. Miravalli is absolutely right that the frequency and length of apparitions is not one of the criteria listed in either the 1978 norms or, for that matter, the 2024 norms. But there are always please don't eat the daisies situations.
Well, that's a reference that many of our younger listeners may not be familiar with. What are you referring to?
It's the title of a book that was published in 1957 by the American humorist Gene Kerr, and there was also later a movie and a TV show by the same title. The phrase refers to situations that cannot be anticipated. Gene Kerr was the mother of 4 boys, and she was once throwing a dinner party that she wanted to make sure went really well, so she gave her boys, who were kind of mischievous, detailed instructions on what not to do during the dinner party. But she could not envision the idea that what the boys would in fact do was eat the daisies that were being used as flower arrangements on the tables. And so she did not tell them, please don't eat the daisies, and that's exactly what they did. In other words, there are situations that a legislator can't reasonably envision, and that's what we're looking at here. Medjugorje is simply unlike anything that has happened before in the recent memory of apparitions. Miravalli is correct when he cites examples of other long-running apparitions, but these are not actual parallels to Medjugorje. In the first place, the situations he mentions did not involve daily apparitions for the lengthy periods of time that he mentions. I mean, for example, Sister Lucia only had a handful of regular apparitions in 1917, and we know of only a few apparitions she had after that. If this was a question of the Medjugorje seers having a handful of apparitions in 1981 and a few very occasional messages in the years since, so this wouldn't be an issue. Even with people like Padre Pio, who had more frequent apparitions, it wasn't daily, and it didn't happen at regular times of the day, but only on occasions. And in no case did the apparitions involve multiple individuals, up to 6, all having daily apparitions at the same time of day for decades, so that the sheer volume of the messages is now approaching 100,000. That's something completely unprecedented in the history of apparitions, so that makes Medjugorje an outlier or something that is not typical or precedented in the history of this area. Now, one of the principles that I and other paranormal investigators use is whether a reported event corresponds to previously reported events. If it's something that is known to happen, then that adds credibility to it. But if it's something that's notable in a different way, if it's an outlier, then there's more reason to doubt it. So I think that the sheer volume of the messages in this case gives us reason to question Medjugorje, or at least phase 2 of it. And this is something that the 2 most recent popes have been sensitive to as well. As we heard last episode, then Cardinal Ratzinger told Bishop Perrick,
"We at the congregation always asked ourselves how a believer could possibly accept as authentic apparitions that occur every day for so many years."
And more recently, Pope Francis has said,
"Our Lady is a mother, and she loves us all. But she is not a postwoman who sends messages every day."
He's also said,
"Those who always need newness from the Christian identity, they have forgotten that they were chosen, anointed, that they have the guarantee of the Spirit. And they search, where are the prophets who tell us today the letter that Our Lady will send us at 4 in the afternoon? For example, no? They live by this. But this is not the Christian identity."
And he has said,
"I prefer Our Lady to be a mother, our mother, and not a telegraph operator who sends out a message every day at a certain time. This is not the mother of Jesus, and these alleged apparitions have no great value. I say this as my personal opinion. Who thinks that Our Lady would say, 'Come tomorrow at this time and I will give a message to that seer'? No."
So even though the frequency and number of apparitions is not one of the criteria explicitly listed in 1978 or 2024, I think it's reasonable to look at a case that is such an extreme outlier and have questions about it. I won't assert that the number of messages by itself is proof of non-supernatural origin, but I'm not willing to just dismiss it either. So let's bracket it and see what else we find.
We now come to claim number 2, that there were immoral priests associated with the visionaries. What should we make of this?
Well, first, let's be clear on what the Church's criteria are regarding this. In both the 1978 and the 2024 norms, we find this listed as a negative criterion.
Gravely immoral actions committed by the subject or the subject followers at or around the time of the event.
So, in terms of the 1978 norms, gravely immoral actions committed by the subject's followers at or around the time of the event would count against a supernatural origin. And in terms of the 2024 norms, it would count against it, given it a nihil obstat or nothing obstructs rating. Now, here is what Cardinal Fernandez says on this topic.
Another point is that at the beginning of these phenomena, there were priests who were not exemplary, even great sinners, close to the alleged visionaries. Father Tomislav Vlasic, who is a great propagandist of Medjugorje, was dismissed. He was a man with many problems and confusions, but it should be clarified that his moral and sexual failings did not involve the alleged visionaries, but other people from outside, especially in Italy. He was not exactly a spiritual director, and in fact, another of the criticisms is that these young people did not have or had any real spiritual direction that could enlighten and guide them. Father Vlasic was provisionally in charge in the parish of Medjugorje for a short time after Father Jozo Zavko, but at the time of the first apparitions, there was Father Jozo. Vlasic was very active in spreading Medjugorje, and from 1986 he moved permanently to Italy. He sought out the children, but it was not true that they were attached to him. In reality, the first apparitions happened when there were no priests in the country, and they continued in the same style when they were no longer there. But it is also true that the Franciscans protected the young people from the persecution of the communist government. 2 Franciscans were dismissed but later rehabilitated by the Apostolic Signatura. Several times they were imprisoned by the communist government. The situation of these Franciscans has many very diverse and complex aspects. Some have even issued a mea culpa for leaving these young children alone in a situation that was beyond them.
So that's Cardinal Fernandez's perspective.
What do you make of it?
To understand this, I'd like to bring in a quotation from Mark Miravalli. He says that
only with an individual priest who had an immediate relation or effect on the visionaries, for example as a spiritual director, could an issue of disobedience play a relevant role in the discernment of the apparitions themselves.
And Miravalli is speaking here of discerning the supernatural or non-supernatural origin of the apparitions, which is what we're looking at presently. So Miravalli concedes that someone like a spiritual director turning out to be gravely immoral would be a negative sign regarding supernaturality, presumably because as the spiritual director of the visionaries, he might influence the visionaries and the contents of their messages. Now, here's the thing. Tomislav Vlasic was widely reported to be the spiritual director of the visionaries in the early years. Cardinal Fernandez says that he was not exactly a spiritual director, which could mean a number of things, including that, well, while he was spiritual director, he was a bad one. So he wasn't being a spiritual director properly. But even that statement admits that he had some kind of spiritual director-like role. In a 2007 document on Medjugorje, Bishop Ratko Peric, the Bishop of Mostar, says that in 1983, Vlasic, quote, was the spiritual director of the seers of Medjugorje, end quote. And in a message from February 28, 1982, Mary reportedly said,
Thank Tomislav very much, for he is guiding you very well. Go in the peace of God, my angels.
So that would confirm Father Vlasic having a guiding role for the visionaries at the time. And Tomislav Vlasic turned out to be a really problematic guy. Cardinal Fernandez alludes to him having many problems and confusions and moral and sexual failings, including getting a nun pregnant. In 1978, as we mentioned, he went to Italy and founded an organization called Queen of Peace, Totally Yours to Jesus Through Mary, which the seer Maria was part of for a time. And according to her, Vlasic pressured her into faking a message from the Madonna, claiming that the organization was her plan or God's plan. But she soon left the organization and retracted the claim. Further, Wikipedia summarizes,
in 2008, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF, informed Vlasic that he was under investigation for the diffusion of dubious doctrine, manipulation of consciences, suspect mysticism, disobedience toward legitimately issued orders, and charges of sexual misconduct, contra sextum, and ordered him to stay at a Franciscan monastery in Lombardy, take a course of theological and spiritual formation, not have contact with the Queen of Peace Association, not get involved in juridical contracts or acts of administration, and not engage in preaching, spiritual direction, public statements, or performing the sacrament of confession under pain of incurring the penalty of automatic interdict. In May 2008, the CDF informed Bishop Ratko Peric of Mostar that Vlasic had incurred the penalty of automatic interdict. Father Tomislav Vlasic was subsequently laicized by Pope Benedict XVI.
But his story didn't stop there. Vlasic went on to found his own church in 2018. It's called the Church of Jesus Christ of the Whole Universe, and Vlasic is the head of it together with his romantic partner. He was thus excommunicated in 2020, and there's more about him that is really wild. We'll have a link to where you can read Wikipedia's summary of it and the sources they quote to document the claims it mentions. In any event, Vlasic is a really problematic guy.
So what light does that shed on whether Medjugorje has a supernatural origin? Could he have manipulated the seers in some way?
Well, he became their spiritual director or spiritual advisor in October of 1981, right at the beginning of the Phase 2 apparitions. And it turns out that Vlasic was the keeper of what is called the chronicle of the early Medjugorje messages. So he was the guy writing it. So he was in a prime position to shape them and how they would be remembered. And there's evidence that he didn't keep the chronicle in a day-by-day way, but instead wrote at least portions of it months after the fact, presumably based on his own memories. And at a time when the visionaries wouldn't remember precisely what the messages from months earlier had stated, which is something the visionaries have acknowledged, that they don't remember the details of messages once they've been written down. And we know that Vlasic later pressured Maria into endorsing his Queen of Peace community as God's plan. So we know he later did shape the messages being reported, raising significant questions about whether he did so earlier. And it isn't just Father Vlasic who was a problematic priest close to the seers. There were others also, though we won't go into their stories. Now, I don't think that what we've covered proves that the messages are of non-supernatural origin, but there are serious questions here that are relevant to the question of supernaturality. So let's bracket this item also and then see what else we discover.
Then what about claim number 1, that a non-supernatural origin is indicated because Medjugorje is tangled up with the Herzegovina affair, that is, the conflict between the Franciscans and the diocesan bishop and clergy?
Here's what Cardinal Fernandez has to say about that.
The darkest and saddest point is the long conflict between the rebel Franciscans, including those who worked in Medjugorje, and the bishops. But this goes far beyond Medjugorje. It began much earlier and did not happen because of Medjugorje, but for other historical reasons that also cast shadows on their work in Medjugorje. This conflict continues today with some rebellious Franciscans, but these are not all connected with Medjugorje. Those who help in Medjugorje together with the Visitator are far from those attitudes. This has been confirmed to me by the Bishop of Mostar, the Apostolic Nuncio, and the Visitator. In other words, it is water under the bridge. On those early days of Medjugorje, the Ruini Commission investigated and concluded that the young people who were psychically healthy were not influenced by anyone, and they agreed that they saw Our Lady.
Okay, so there are 2 points here. The first is that as far as Medjugorje is concerned, the conflict between the Franciscans and the diocesan authorities has been patched up. It's water under the bridge. That's good, and that means that there is no current obstacle so that a nihil obstat can be granted, which is what Cardinal Fernandez is focused on. But here, we're interested in a different question. Here, we're considering whether the messages have a supernatural origin, which leads us to the second point. You'll note the last thing Cardinal Fernandez said about the Ruini Commission concluding that in the early days, the visionaries were not influenced by anyone. That refers to Phase 1 of the apparitions, which occurred between June 24th and July 3rd, 1981. But the Ruini commissioners did not say that the visionaries weren't influenced by others in Phase 2, and we have evidence of interference in Phase 2. You'll recall last episode where we quoted from John Thavis's book, The Vatican Prophecies, where he said,
The apparitions continued and the messages from Mary accumulated, recorded in some of the visionaries' diaries. It became clear that the Blessed Mother was siding with the disobedient Franciscans against Bishop Paweł Zanik. On more than one occasion, according to notebook entries made by the seer Vika Ivankovic, Mary was consulted about the situation of 2 Franciscan priests who had been ordered to surrender control of parishes in Mostar. She had supposedly answered that the bishop was to blame and that the priests should continue their ministry. Bishop Zanik interpreted this as a clear sign that the visionaries were being manipulated and that the apparitions themselves were fake.
And this is significant evidence that the visionaries were being manipulated, which raises a question about the supernatural origin of the Phase 2 messages. In fact, the DDF's document specifically warns.
There are other expressions that run the risk of being misinterpreted, as is the case with the messages for the parish. In them, Our Lady seems to want to exercise control over the details of the parish's spiritual and pastoral journey, including requests for days of fasting or specific commitments to undertake for the various liturgical seasons, giving the impression that she wants to take the place of the ordinary parish structures meant for participation. Sometimes, as we can see in the messages that follow, the special care that Our Lady wants to exercise over the parish to the point of recrimination that her pastoral directions are not being obeyed. Our Lady's messages cannot replace the ordinary role of the parish priest, the pastoral council, and the synodal work of the community regarding decisions that are the subject of communal discernment, through which the parish matures in prudence, fraternal listening, respect for others, and dialogue.
Well, orders about the assignments of priests to particular parishes that contradict what the local bishop has determined would go into this category. So this is a sign that at least these messages should not be considered supernatural. But let's also put a bracket around this for the moment.
As you've said, Cardinal Fernandez wasn't focused on the question of supernaturality, but we've now worked our way through all 10 of the arguments Cardinal Fernandez considered. Are there other arguments regarding supernaturality that we should consider?
There are 3 additional arguments that I think need to be looked at. The first has to do with the lifestyle of the visionaries. Now, I've already said that they don't need to display heroic virtue or become priests and religious sisters, but the 1978 norms include this as a negative criterion about supernaturality.
Evidence of a search for profit or gain strictly connected to the event.
In the 2024 norms, this was rephrased as follows as a negative criterion, not directed towards supernaturality specifically, but it still applies as a negative criterion.
An overt pursuit of profit, power, fame, social recognition, or other personal interests closely linked to the event.
Well, as we heard, John Thavis writes the following in his book, The Vatican Prophecies.
Mariana, who is married with 2 daughters, today runs a pilgrim's guest house near her home. That provides much-needed income for her family and gives visitors a chance to speak at length with the visionary. At least 2 of the other Medjugorje seers also manage accommodation facilities for visitors. While some have criticized this as a conflict of interest, no one in the town considers it strange, as virtually every family here has profited from the pilgrim boom by adding guest rooms or building hotels.
So if you're one of the visionaries and you're running a guest house for pilgrims, that's starting to look sketchy. It's starting to look like a search for profit in connection with the apparitions, and at least 3 of the seers are doing that. This was a concern shared by others. While the Ruini Commission documents haven't been publicly released, many of them have been leaked and published in Italian. I was able to get a translation of part of an appendix written by 2 commission members, and they said,
The CDF's protocol requires us to take the evidence seeking a profit closely connected to the event as a negative element. In the case of the seers of Medjugorje, it can certainly be said that this presents itself as the most critical aspect, which imparts a sense of profound unease. It is impossible to deny that the direct involvement of the visionaries in pilgrimage excursion packages, in high-profile stays in the context of conventions, with the attendant exhibition of ecstasies, in the building and ownership of infrastructure intended for hotel hospitality, is very disturbing. The exhibition of the charism appears to be set within an intrusive commercial organization rather than a sober context of ecclesial life. The relationship between the unfolding of the event and the seer's increase in personal household properties and the raising of their standard of living is well established. The gratitude and generosity of the pilgrims, of course, is possible and even likely. But this is precisely the issue. To what other personal or professional resources could the conspicuous achieved benefits of well-being be linked, if not to the usage of the apparitional event? In a relatively poor area, the overall level of the housing and goods at the seer's disposition would be considered upper middle class, even in a rich urban context. The overall picture of the tenor and lifestyle of some of the members of the group, then, offers an image that is not congruent with the responsibility of guarding and administering such an exceptional charisma as this one, which has been presented as enduring. Perhaps we do not have all the certainty one could desire regarding an evidence-seeking of profit closely connected with the event. However, the event is conspicuously connected with elements of profit. The uncertainty of this specific point absolutely must be resolved.
And I have to say that the actions of the seers do raise a question about whether they can be fairly seen as engaged in, quote, an overt pursuit of profit, power, fame, social recognition, or other personal interest closely linked to the event, close quote. So while it's not decisive, it is evidence of the non-supernaturality of phase 2 of the apparitions when this is the kind of lifestyle adopted by the seers.
What's the next argument we should consider?
As I've noted, the sheer number of messages associated with Medjugorje, approaching 100,000, is simply unprecedented in church history. That makes Medjugorje atypical for an apparition. That doesn't prove that it's non-supernatural, but it does raise a question. But this isn't the only way in which Medjugorje is atypical. As we heard in our first episode on the apparition, episode 337, there are also 10 secrets associated with it, and the seers know the dates and times these are supposed to occur. And they've said that the third secret is the appearance of a permanent, indestructible sign on the hill of the apparition, something that's never been seen before on earth and that could only be made by God. The existence of the secrets was announced early in phase 2, and it was announced in phase 2 that the Virgin Mary had said Medjugorje is the final Marian apparition in world history, that she will not appear again, so that other ongoing Marian apparitions would apparently shut down.
What do you make of these facts?
Well, there have been secrets associated with other Marian apparitions, so I don't have a problem with Medjugorje having 10 secrets, but I do think it's noteworthy that today, 43 years later, none of the secrets have happened. That's not disproof of them being real, but it is notable. However, both the secrets and the claim that Medjugorje is the last apparition of all have aspects that make Medjugorje unprecedented in the history of apparitions. This is most obviously the case in the claim that Medjugorje is the last one in world history. That of itself would make it an outlier compared to all previous apparitions, and if I think about it with a pro-Medjugorje hat on, I can even make sense of that. If Medjugorje is the last apparition, then maybe that's why there have been such an anomalously large number of messages coming through it. That doesn't prove anything, but at least the two ideas could go together.
What about the secrets? What makes them unprecedented?
You'll recall that in episode 337 that the seers have a way of remembering the 10 secrets. As Wayne Weibel explained in his book Medjugorje, The Last Apparition,
it was learned in July 1981 that the secrets would be revealed by a priest chosen by visionary Mirjana. She chose Father Peter Ljubicic, a Franciscan priest who was at one time stationed in Medjugorje but then reassigned to a place a good distance from the parish. In the early months of the apparitions, the Madonna presented Mirjana a strange parchment that contained all 10 secrets written in an unknown language. The parchment was neither cloth nor paper, but of a material unknown on earth. It could be bald and wrinkled but not torn. All the secrets are written on this parchment in an unknown language. Of course, Mirjana knows all of the secrets, including the day and date of each one. The same is true with Ivanka and Yakov. 10 days before the first secret is to be revealed, Father Peter will be given the parchment containing the secrets. He will only be able to read the first one. During the 10 days, Father Peter, along with Mirjana, will spend the first 7 days in fasting and prayer. 3 days before the event is to take place, he will announce it to the world by whatever means he chooses. At the proper time, he will be able to see and read the second secret, and then the third, etc., according to the schedule of heaven. Mirjana has stated that Father Peter does not have the right to choose whether to say or not to say what each secret is. He accepted this mission, and he has to fulfill it according to God's will.
Except there's more to the parchment than that, because as we heard, Mirjana claimed to have shown the parchment to a couple of people, and they saw different things in it. One saw a letter, like a letter you'd write someone, and one saw certain poems. So it's not just in an unknown language. You actually see different things depending on who you are. And Father Peter will apparently see it decoded line by line as the secrets happen. Furthermore, neither of the two people to whom Mirjana is said to have shown it are available to verify that claim. But according to Mirjana, she decided that after they saw different things on it, that she wasn't supposed to show it to anyone else. So nobody can see and examine the parchment today, and nobody can test it to find out whether it really is a material not known on Earth, or whether different people really do see different things on it.
Could God make such a parchment?
Oh, I don't have any question that God could make such a parchment if he chose. God is omnipotent, and he can actualize any state of affairs that doesn't involve a logical contradiction. I don't see a logical contradiction here, so I conclude God could do all this with a miracle. But to propose a miracle, you need evidence for the miracle. And at a minimum, this parchment seems to be an outlier. It's unlike any miracle in the Bible, and it's unlike any miracle I know of from Christian history. So it appears to be unprecedented, making the secrets and they're being recorded on this parchment where people see different things and it gets decoded piece by piece over time is one more unprecedented thing about the history of the apparitions.
What do you make about the claim of the parchment?
Well, we've got a supernatural manuscript, and you need a special spiritual endowment to read it, like Father Peter will have when he gets to read it line by line when the secrets start happening, but nobody's allowed to see it now. So a manuscript in an unknown language that you need a supernatural endowment to read, and nobody gets to see it. This is starting to sound like Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates. Only it's more than that, because the golden plates were said to be written in Reformed Egyptian. You may have needed a spiritual endowment to read them then in the 1830s, since nobody could read Egyptian at the time, but people wouldn't see different things on the golden plates if they didn't have the right spiritual endowment, which is what is being claimed here. Frankly, anytime someone says, I have a record of divine revelations that I can't show you, but I want you to believe me, I get suspicious. It's Sherlock Holmes in the case of the missing evidence. If you want me to believe your claims, especially if they involve the paranormal or miraculous activity, then I need to see evidence. And, I've got evidence, but I can't show it to you, won't do. I would want to have researchers look at the parchment and find out what the parchment is made of. I would want people to look at it and see if they really do see different things on it. But no, we're not allowed to do that. And there is no indication that either the Ruini Commission or the DDF got to do those things either. So this is extremely suspicious to me. It's also been noted that even though the seers talked a lot about the secrets in the early days, they talk about them a lot less now, like they're de-emphasizing them, which could be a sign that they'd like people to forget about them.
Then what do you make of Medjugorje overall?
If we take the messages as a whole, there are a number of factors that point towards a non-supernatural origin. An individual factor may not prove it by itself, and in fact, the 1978 norm said, don't count on any one criterion to prove or disprove. It needs to be a cumulative effect. But together, the factors we have remaining do point in that direction and make a cumulative case for non-supernaturality. First, there's the astonishing, unprecedented number of reported messages associated with the apparition. Then there's the immoral priests who look like they may have shaped the messages in phase 2, like Father Tomislav Vlasic, who we know got Maria to lie for him, and who was their spiritual director or advisor, and who kept the chronicle of the early messages, but apparently wrote it months after the events in question. And other Franciscan priests who have intentionally or unintentionally caused the seers to announce messages favoring the Franciscans and telling them to defy the lawful orders of the bishop in the Herzegovina affair. Then there's the fact that the seers live lifestyles that are well above normal for the area, including owning rental properties to cater to pilgrims. Then there's the fact that Medjugorje is the last Marian apparition, so you better get in on it now. Then there is the non-fulfillment of all of the secrets and the fact that the secrets are supposed to be written on a parchment that is unprecedented in the history of miracles and that cannot be shown to anyone. Putting all this together, I just don't buy that this is supernatural. It's just too suspicious on too many fronts. I'm afraid I agree with Pope Francis that the messages coming out now do not have much value and should not be looked upon as genuinely coming from Jesus' mother.
Does that mean that you utterly reject Medjugorje as supernatural?
Well, here comes a twist for this episode. No, I don't. All of the problematic elements we've covered pertain to phase 2 of the apparitions, or what happened after July 3rd, 1981. But what about phase 1 from June 24th to July 3rd? We already knew from Pope Francis something about what the Ruini Commission concluded, but at the press conference, Cardinal Fernandez gave us more details. He said,
With regard to the initial phase of the Medjugorje phenomenon, the Commission considers that, in the first 7 apparitions, between 24 June and 3 July 1981, the youngsters, psychically healthy, were not influenced by anyone, and they unanimously testified that they saw Our Lady entrusting them with messages of conversion and penance. In other words, the devotion that has arisen in Medjugorje has a supernatural origin. It is authentic. And these are the results of the vote on the first 7 alleged apparitions. Confirmed as supernatural, 13 votes in favor. Confirmed as not supernatural, 1. It is yet to be decided, 1.
So of the 15 commission members, 13, or 87%, voted in favor of supernaturality for phase 1. That's a strong signal. When it comes to phase 2,
with regard to the supernatural nature of the subsequent apparitions, the report says that in the successive phase, one might think of an external influx on the part of various subjects, and that the apparitions become almost planned. Although only 2 members expressed a confirmed as not supernatural for these successive apparitions, 12 members instead voted with, it is yet to be decided. That is, they were unable to issue a definitive judgment.
So in this case, 12 of 14 members, or 86%, weren't able to arrive at a conclusion, and the other 2 said it was non-supernatural. However, I've already explained why I don't find phase 2 credible as supernatural for the reasons we've covered.
We've heard that a few authors have claimed that Medjugorje is of demonic origin. Do you think that there is significant evidence that phase 2 is demonic?
No, I haven't seen significant evidence for that. Demons want to do things like deceive people about matters of the faith, and I would expect them to have built more obvious lies about doctrine into the phase 2 messages, but as the DDF has noted, the vast bulk of phase 2 messages are doctrinally orthodox, and it's only a handful of messages that are imprecise and need to be interpreted carefully or set aside. And those messages don't really have to do with doctrines of the faith. They're more about the parish and stuff like that. So that's not to say that the seers couldn't start denying the faith in messages in the future, but that hadn't happened yet. And so I don't currently have notable evidence for the demonic. Now, I know some people would say, oh, well, they promoted disunity in these early messages, in the Herzegovina affair and defying the bishop, and all that's true. And yeah, demons are interested in stuff like that. But as Cardinal Fernandez pointed out, that's faded now. That's water under the bridge in connection with Medjugorje. That is not going on now. And we don't need demons to explain that. We just need Franciscan priests who are opposed to the bishop's orders, like Father Vlasic. So we don't have to propose demons to explain that. And I'm not going to rush to the demon hypothesis without serious evidence. I don't see anything about phase 2 that can't be accounted for by purely human agency.
So how do you regard phase 1?
Well, my default position is to defer to whatever the church has concluded, or at least to what church experts have concluded, and I only tend to deviate from that if I have evidence that warrants me in doing so. I wasn't on the Ruini Commission, and I haven't read their documents, but 87% of the commission members supported supernaturality for phase 1 is something I take note of. So I tentatively accept the supernaturality of phase 1. That's a tentative acceptance. I'm not wedded to it. Apparently, many of the documents from the Ruini Commission have been published in Italian, and so if they're published in English and in the future I get to read them, I might change my mind. I might become stronger in thinking that phase 1 was supernatural, or I might conclude that it wasn't supernatural. But for now, I tentatively accept it.
Do you still have outstanding questions about Medjugorje?
Absolutely. For example, I'd love to know how sincere the seers are today. Do they really believe that they're in contact with the Virgin Mary or not? I don't know how to answer that question either way. They may be totally sincere or they may not be. The supernatural parchment being a point of evidence against sincerity. Do you really have that? Can I see that? But if they are sincere, then I'd love to know more about how the transition from phase 1 to phase 2 happened from their perspective. I mean, if they really were in contact with the Virgin Mary in phase 1, how did phase 2 develop? What role precisely was played by problematic priests like Father Vlasic? And did the seers note anything different between phase 1 and phase 2? But I defer to the Ruini Commission on phase 1, and I think the evidence points towards non-supernaturality for phase 2.
Do you think we'll ever get more information on these subjects?
I think it's possible. The seers have indicated that the 10 secrets are supposed to happen in the lifetimes of all 6 seers. The oldest of the seers, Vika, is now 60 years old, and most are within a year or two of that age. So sometime between the next 10 and 30 years, we should get more data to help settle the question. If the 10 secrets start happening with Father Peter or another priest playing his appointed role with the supernatural parchment, then that would be evidence favoring the supernaturality of phase 2. But if none of the secrets have been announced and happened by the time the first seer passes on to their reward, then that would be evidence against the supernaturality of phase 2. At a minimum, the seers would need to announce that heaven had a change of plans, but it would still be evidence against supernaturality. We thus have a testable situation, and we should have more evidence in the next few years.
Anything you'd like to say before we go?
Yes, I'd just like to remind folks that I am not dogmatic about my conclusions here. In fact, I've said my conclusion on phase 1 is tentative. I'm more sure about phase 2, but I don't hold that conclusion dogmatically. I'm just doing my best to wrestle with a question I know people are interested in and would like me to let them know what I think. And I didn't have to do that. I could have just ended with the Vatican document last episode and not addressed the question of supernaturality, but I knew people wanted to know my analysis, and so I've tried my best to provide one. I went into this from a position of neutrality without strong opinions on either side, but my research led me in the direction of supernaturality on phase 1 and non-supernaturality on phase 2. If you disagree with me, that is totally fine. You're entitled to your own views based on your own analysis of the evidence. I just ask that you take a charitable view of me and appreciate how I tried to come at this honestly, fairly, and without hostility towards either side.
And so, Jimmy, finally, what's your bottom line on Medjugorje?
The Ruini Commission had a strong signal favoring the supernaturality of Phase 1 of the apparitions of Medjugorje, and I don't have reason to challenge them on that, so I tentatively accept its finding of supernaturality. Many of the arguments for the supernaturality of Phase 2 are not persuasive to me, and many of the arguments against the supernaturality of Phase 2 are also not persuasive to me. However, there are enough remaining factors that raise doubts about it that I ultimately conclude against the supernaturality of Phase 2, and in that, I agree with Pope Francis.
And Jimmy, what further resources are we offering to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to Wayne Weibel's book, Medjugorje, The Last Apparition, Mark Miravalli and Wayne Weibel's book, Are the Medjugorje Apparitions Authentic?, John Thavis's book, The Vatican Prophecies, Sister Lucia's book, Fatima in Lucia's Own Words, the 2024 Vatican document on Medjugorje, and the press conference announcing the Medjugorje decision. Also, the paper I mentioned estimating the impact of the Hajj, religion and tolerance in Islam's global gathering. James Paul Pandurakalam's article, Are the Apparitions of Medjugorje Real? The article, Learning Styles Debunked. Also, the condemnations of the Francis Klug apparitions, information about rosaries turned into gold, info about and videos about Jean-Louis Martin's test of Wicca, Dr. Giorgio Gagliardi's statements regarding the ecstasies, St. Catherine of Genoa's treatise on purgatory, information about Tomislav Vlasic, and Bishop Ratko Perik's statement on Medjugorje.
All right. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Jimmy's analysis of Medjugorje? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. You can check out how much they add to Mysterious World by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me out. Please help me grow my channel. I'm currently getting near that 100,000 subscribers threshold, which may help the channel grow even further. And I'd really appreciate your help in getting there. So be sure and like, comment, subscribe, share the video, and be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified after you subscribe whenever I have a new video. These days, I have new videos for you every day, so lots of good Jimmy Akin video goodness.
I also want to thank Rob Beatty and Anna Fontaine for their voiceover work on this episode. So Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week is a Fifth Friday, so we're going to be doing our Fifth Friday Weird Questions show, and we'll be looking at questions like the serpent from the Garden of Eden, Time Lords and the Sunday Obligation, how I personally remember things, invalid civil marriages, Jesus and other planets, what if only Eve had eaten the apple, deja vu, and more.
Be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should hit the bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/339. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Join a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go on pilgrimage to the mysterious shrines and sites of Italy in the Jubilee year 2025 with Jimmy Akin and me, Dom Bettinelli. Go with us on a 12-day, all-inclusive tour that gives you incredible access to Jimmy's insights in Rome, Assisi, Orvieto, Monte Cassino, San Giovanni Rotondo, the Grotto of St. Michael, and more. We're also planning special activities like recording on location for future episodes of Mysterious World and an in-person Weird Questions episode just for pilgrims. Space is limited and filling up, so be sure to find out more. Visit mysterious.fm/Italy 2025 to reserve your spot today. That's mysterious.fm/Italy 2025. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.